Good morning, everyone. I'm Tamiko Brown-Nagin, the Dean of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our conference this morning, The Age of Roe, the Past, Present, and Future of Abortion in America. Now, our proceedings began yesterday evening with perspectives from the front lines of debates about abortion, birth, health disparities, and more. And today's convening will continue to probe the legacy of Roe versus Wade. This past Sunday marked the 50th anniversary of that landmark 1973 decision in which the U.S. Supreme Court held, by a 7-2 vote, that the constitutional right to privacy protects a woman's right to decide whether to have an abortion. The decision permitted millions of American women to elect abortions, and for 5 decades, millions of women relied on access to abortion as they ordered their lives. But the right to elect abortion was never absolute. It was a qualified right, meaning that the state retained power to regulate the procedure at different points of a pregnancy. And opponents of abortion rights always contested it, inside the courtroom and outside. The courtroom battle yielded numerous decisions that over time restricted access to abortion. Planned Parenthood versus Casey, decided in 1992, constituted a critically important landmark in the ongoing social and legal battle over abortion. Indeed, many thought the age of Roe would end when the Supreme Court decided Casey. Instead, Roe survived. A divided court held in Casey, left intact in Casey, Roe's essential holding that women could elect abortion, but permitted increased state regulation of the procedure. The right to abortion remained intact, if endangered, for another 30 years. Well, all that changed last year when the U.S. Supreme Court overruled both Roe and Casey in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. In Dobbs, the court held that there is no constitutional right to abortion and that the power to regulate abortion lies with the people and their elected representatives. Following Dobbs, the battle over abortion rights shifted back to legislatures and to the states. Now, rooted as it is in these landmark cases, it might be tempting to view the age of Roe as principally about the law. And to be sure, Roe and Dobbs raise complex questions of constitutional law. And yet, as I've written in my own work about law and social change, Supreme Court opinions are never divorced from the broader cultural and social context. Rather, these decisions both shape and reflect national debates about controversial issues. The legal historian Mary Ziegler, a prominent scholar of law and politics around abortion rights and a key contributor to today's conference, has led scholarly examination in recent years of Roe's sweeping social and political reach. She has explained that the case represents, quote, much more than a single Supreme Court decision. Indeed, Roe's influence extends far beyond courtrooms and law school classrooms. It has galvanized political and social movements. It casts a spotlight on intricacies of our democratic system and the role of the courts, legislatures, and everyday citizens in effecting change. It has even prompted reevaluation of how history shapes the present and how historical interpretation shapes the law, or should shape the law. Beyond law and politics, the abortion debate has changed healthcare and the doctor-patient relationship. It has raised profound and enduring questions of faith, ethics, and morality, as well as liberty, justice, and equality. These questions in turn interact with gender, race, class, and religion. And of course, debates around reproduction are not limited to the US. This is a global debate. And it is among our most contentious in an increasingly charged and polarized public discourse. In light of this complexity, understanding Roe and its legacy requires insight from across disciplines and from divergent perspectives. Well, that is what we do here at Radcliffe. We support robust and reasoned exchange, and we do so in the pursuit of new, empowering knowledge and deeper understanding. I'm proud that the Institute engages with the most pressing questions of our time. And as we do, our commitment to civil discourse, even and especially when we strenuously disagree, is more important than ever. Today's convening deliberately reflects this ethos, as my colleague Jane Kaminsky will explain in just a moment. Now, let me offer some thanks. First and foremost, I want to sincerely thank all of our speakers and moderators for sharing their perspectives and experiences with us today. I also want to thank everyone who was involved in making this convening possible. I'm especially grateful to Jane Kaminsky, to Patrina Jackson, and to the staff of the Schlesinger Library, and to all of the members of the Planning Committee. Special thanks as well to Mary Ziegler, the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law at UC Davis School of Law, who, in addition to helping plan this conference, also curated the accompanying exhibition in the Schlesinger Library's Poorview Gallery. I also want to thank Rebecca Wasserman, who is Executive Director of Academic Ventures and Engagement at Radcliffe, Jessica Vicklin, Director of Events, and their outstanding teams. Let me also recognize members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and all our annual donors, whose generosity keeps Radcliffe lectures, conferences, exhibitions, and collections free and open to the public, and we thank you. Finally, I'm grateful to all of you in our virtual and our in-person audiences for joining us today for what promises to be a powerful and illuminating set of discussions. And now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Jane Kaminsky, who is the Forsheimer Foundation Director of the Arthur and Elizabeth Schlesinger Library on the History of Women in America here at Radcliffe, as well as the Jonathan Trumbull Professor of American History and Harvard's Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Please join me in warmly welcoming Jane to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Tomiko, and thanks to all of you here and online for joining us to do a hard and important thing, to have rich, nuanced conversations about what is arguably the most difficult single issue in American life at every level, from the pregnant body to the household to the State House and Congress and the Supreme Court. As Tomiko noted, Radcliffe greatly prizes robust and respectful exchange across many lines that divide us from each other, and we know it isn't easy. Talking is harder than trolling. Talking is harder than racking up snaps and props and likes in our echo chambers. But talking across as well as within our hidden tribes is, at its core, the work of democracy and of the civil renewal that we need so badly in the United States. So thank you all for answering the call to participate in that work, whether you're doing it from the stage or from the audience. I want to do a little bit of genealogy to getting us here. This convening grows out of Radcliffe's century-long commitment to the study of women, gender, and society, and it also grows out of Schlesinger Library's collections, which document that history as completely as possible, but never completely enough. We have been dedicated over generations to recognizing and repairing the gaps in our archival collections so that scholars and other storytellers confront a more complete record of the human past. In the fall of 2016, we held an event right here called Writing the Record, which addressed the ideological dimension of our gaps. And in some ways, the Age of Roe grows out of those conversations and the multiple collections that have arrived to document the contest over abortion since. Last year, you may know we welcomed the Joseph R. Stanton Pro-Life Collection donated by the Sisters of Life in New York. Those 350 plus boxes of material join and do combat with the records of NARAL Pro-Choice America and of the Society for Humane Abortion, the papers of reproductive rights activist Bill Baird, and of National Right to Life Committee President Dr. Mildred Jefferson, and many, many others. There are 3 separate library guides for collections that touch on pregnancy, family life, birth control, and abortion at Schlesinger. Some of the work that you'll learn about today derives from evidence in those collections. A shorter history. In July 2020, I reached out to Mary Ziegler, as Tomiko said, the preeminent historian of the world that made Roe and the world that Roe made, to begin planning for the decision's 50th anniversary. Mary and I have been working with many of you on this conference and on the related exhibition, which she curated with my library colleagues ever since, so that's almost 3 years. We have held scores of Zooms and have traded hundreds and possibly thousands of emails. This gathering would not be possible without Mary's work in all senses of the word. I'm grateful, too, to the many other planners who joined the effort beginning in the fall of 2020. Some 14 of the 28 speakers on the program have undertaken this planning work together, growing as we proceeded, even and perhaps, as Tomiko said, especially where we disagreed, sometimes fiercely. Let me also call out the behind-the-scenes labor of Schlesinger curator Jenny Gottwals and the many other Schlesinger Library staff, colleagues who solicited, cultivated, packed, accessioned, processed the collections that provide the rich evidence on which all true stories must rest, and who also did the hard behind-the-scenes lifting of the exhibition. I want to echo Tomiko in thanking Rebecca Wasserman and Jessica Vicklin, too. Their work reads to you as an absence. There's no ruffling in a Radcliffe event. All the seamlessness that greets you as travelers and conveners is made possible by them. And I want to thank our philanthropic supporters, many of whom are with us today, for making the painstaking work of events like this and of our collections possible. I know you're all eager to get down to it, so I'll just say 3 more things. First, I want to say something about goals. If such conversations are so hard, why have them? What does success look like from a bold and even risky endeavor like the one that you and I and our speakers are undertaking last night and today? You will hear things that you disagree with, even violently. You will hear things that you either believe or know not to be true. My goal for our proceedings is that everyone listening, truly listening, will 1, learn something they didn't know, and 2, witness a way of framing a problem that you haven't yet practiced. Notice that I didn't say, I hope you'll change your minds, or I hope you'll meet in the middle, though both of those things might be possible whenever unlike minds converse in good faith, as everyone sharing the stage today is doing. I do hope that you might find, along with new knowledge and fresh framing, potential collaborators, perhaps surprising to you, with whom to work on the enormous problems of parenthood and family life in the United States, for which Roe became, over the course of 49 years and 10 months, a flattening synecdoche. So that's 1, goals. 2, I want to give you a very quick sketch of the arc of our program today, picking up from last night's discussion centered on the work of stories. We begin with international contexts, featuring panelists who approach the age of Roe from outside US borders, looking in at our peculiarities, or from the way that US family planning policy projected out beyond the United States. Our second panel deepens and continues the conversation from last night on the vexed topic of race and class, including persistent disparities in healthcare and abortion access, as well as in maternal and infant outcomes. After a break for lunch, we'll hear cutting-edge research on reproduction and American public life, including political party formation, social movement organizing, and religious community transformation. Throughout those panels, whether you're watching with us in person or online, you can submit questions at any time using the Slido link behind me on the screen here and posted in the chat of the Zoom webinar. Then our final session, instead of a keynote, we culminate with a kind of chorus, 9 distinctive visions of or for the future, thinking about what the age of Dobbs might come to look like at some vantage point in the future. The last thing I want to share is a bit about the way I've thought about language in relation to today's program, a topic that MT Davila will take on later this morning in her remarks. You've probably noticed in your reading and your viewing of whatever periodicals and programs that different organizations have different kinds of house style around abortion. So Harvard publications, for instance, use pro-choice and anti-abortion as their categories. Many organizations on the right use pro-life and pro-abortion, or abortionists, or culture of death. You heard last night, and we'll hear more this morning, about the ways that the reproductive justice frame challenges the individual rights / neoliberal bases of pro-choice as a framing category. My own decision in this space is to call people what they call themselves and not what they call each other. I think this is consistent with the Schlesinger Library's meticulous approach to archival description and consistent, too, with what I take to be the historian's 2 highest duties, to truth and to empathy. I want to recognize that we meet this morning knowing that we are not, in fact, one we seeking the same thing. That's our challenge, and it's also our strength. And with that, I'll turn the program over to my trusted, brilliant colleagues to begin a conversation that I expect to confound labels and expectations and take us forward. Let me now invite Alicia Yamin, who is Senior Fellow on Global Health and Rights at the Petrie Flom Center of Harvard Law School and an expert on sexual and reproductive health rights in a global context, to the podium to introduce and curate our first panel. Thank you all.
Good morning, everybody. And first, I want to thank the organizers, Dean Brown-Nagin, Professor Kamensky, all of the people who have worked tirelessly behind the scenes, of course, Professor Mary Ziegler. And I also want to thank them for putting this international panel first, because this is a topic that sits at the intersection of private morality and public policy across the globe and has been the subject of deep contestation across the globe. And I think it's an excellent decision to open the panel with the multiplicity of ways this has been handled in a variety of different kinds of countries. There's no one particular trajectory. The genealogies of struggles for abortion on both sides have been very different, given different laws, given different kinds of health systems, given different ways in which activists have framed this issue and built coalitions, again, on both sides. I have worked a lot in Latin America with the Green Wave movement, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from our 3 esteemed panelists this morning, whom I will introduce just by their affiliation, and you can see then online their full bios, which are quite extraordinary and far too long to read. So first, Fiona de Londras, who is the chair of Global Legal Studies at Birmingham Law School, if you could come up. Donald Critchlow, who is the Katzin Family Professor at Arizona State University. And finally, Ruby Lai, who is Assistant Professor in the Department of Sociology and Social Policy at the Lingnan University in Hong Kong. We'll have brief presentations from each of the panelists, and then we'll have a discussion. I encourage you all to start thinking about questions you may have now that you can submit through Slido. After the panelists make their discussions, we will weave together a question and answer session with discussion among the panelists. So I will first invite Fiona de Londras to give remarks from the table.
Thank you. Good morning. Let me echo the thanks that my colleagues have already expressed to all those involved in convening this event. I want to tell you a story, or a couple of stories, about Ireland. In September 1983, shortly before my 3rd birthday, my parents joined with 1.25 million other Irish people in voting on whether or not to insert a new provision into our Constitution. That provision was inserted, the 8th Amendment to the 1937 Constitution. It provided that the state acknowledges the right to life of the unborn, and with due regard to the equal right to life of the mother, guarantees in its laws to respect and, as far as practicable by its laws, to defend and vindicate that right. So 10 years after Roe, partly in anticipation of Irish courts doing something similar, and to some extent influenced by transatlantic discourses and exchange between anti-abortion activists in Ireland and the US, Ireland went further than the US Supreme Court did in Dobbs last year. Not only was there definitively no constitutional right to access abortion, but there was a constitutional prohibition on abortion, grounded in a constitutionally protected fetal right to life, what in this country might be called a fetal personhood law. This bolstered pre-existing criminal prohibitions on abortion and obliged the state to defend and vindicate the fetal right to life. The anti-abortion laws and practices introduced to give effect to the 8th Amendment will sound grimly familiar to many of you here today. Not only was abortion a crime, but abortion information was censored and its distribution sometimes criminalized. Assistance and provision of abortion was a crime carrying a sentence of up to life imprisonment, including for the woman. Medical referral for abortion care in another country was a crime. Anti-abortion activist groups established that they had legal standing to take cases to vindicate the fetal right to life, effectively privatizing enforcement. There were attempts, frequent, formal and informal, to prevent pregnant or suspected pregnant people from leaving the country. In keeping with the nature of fetal personhood laws, there were no exceptions to the ban on abortion, or rather there was one, extremely narrow exception, confirmed by the Irish Supreme Court in 1992. And that was that abortion was constitutionally permitted if there was a real and substantial risk to the life rather than the health of the pregnant woman that could only be averted by termination of pregnancy and the fetus was not viable. That Supreme Court decision was followed by another referendum in which the government proposed to make clear that a qualifying, if you'll excuse the term, risk to life did not include suicide. That was not successful. Neither was a second attempt around a decade later. But 2 other referenda were successful, confirming that travel for abortion was permitted and that access to abortion information as regulated by law was also permitted. Now, those 2 minor changes only scratched the surface of the harms that the 8th Amendment produced in everyday reproductive life. Unlike with other cross-border medical care, the Irish state would not assist financially or otherwise with going abroad to access abortion. Even in situations of diagnosed fatal fetal anomaly, it remained a serious criminal offence for a doctor to transfer care to a medic in another jurisdiction. Indeed, so injurious was the situation that the UN Human Rights Committee confirmed it violated the right to be free from torture, inhuman and degrading treatment and punishment. But as people across this country are now realizing, abortion bans affect all pregnant women and undermine care and dignity throughout pregnancy. In Ireland, that was evident in the national consent policy, which stated that pregnant women's wishes could be overridden if they were considered to endanger fetal life. Indeed, pregnant women were the only people with legal and mental capacity whose informed consent could be overridden in this way. Pregnant people who were diagnosed with serious illnesses sometimes had their care delayed because of concerns that treatment might endanger fetal life and be inadvertently unconstitutional. In some cases, care for pregnancy loss was complicated by the blurred line between miscarriage management and abortion care, sometimes with fatal consequences. Throughout maternity services, the Eighth Amendment operated as a usually subtle, but sometimes articulated part of an atmosphere of reproductive coercion and fetocentrism experienced and reported by many, although by no means all, women who went through pregnancy. And still, women had abortions. Tens of thousands of women left Ireland to access abortion abroad, usually in England. Many thousands, once it became available, availed of safe, easy-to-use abortion medications, access through reliable providers like Women Help Women and Women on Web, and self-managed abortion illegally. We don't know how many people continued their pregnancies against their will, but we do know that maternal mortality remained low, except, unsurprisingly, among migrant women and women of colour, partly because of a generally good health system, but primarily because of the availability of abortion in England, our escape hatch over the Irish Sea. Then in May 2018, the Eighth Amendment was repealed. A new abortion law followed. That law looks very restrictive if you look at it through Roe-tinted glasses. Abortion is available on request up to 12 weeks, subject to a 3-day mandatory waiting period and with no special consent laws or rules for minors who have capacity. From 12 weeks to fetal viability, abortion is available on very narrow grounds, risk to life or a risk of serious injury to health. In emergencies and cases of fetal diagnosis, likely to cause death before or within 28 days of birth, abortion is available without gestational limit, or at least it is legal, not always available. Abortion remains a serious crime, but never for the pregnant person. That this law is valorized as progressive tells us a lot about how deeply the Eighth Amendment continues to shape our expectations of reproductive justice in Ireland, even after its formal demise. Our journey from one of the world's most restrictive abortion laws to something that meets the needs of most, although not all, pregnant people who seek abortion in Ireland elicits great excitement and interest. What, people ask me, can we learn from Ireland? The answer, I suggest, is both nothing and everything. The nothing is because Ireland's experience of abortion law reform is unique, just as your experience in the United States is. The Eighth Amendment shored up pre-existing criminal prohibitions on abortion through what I've previously called a triple lock. Courts could not liberalise abortion law because the text was too tight. Parliament could not legalise abortion because the Constitution prohibited it. And the people could not force political change through ordinary electoral processes because our Constitution can only be amended by referendum, and referenda can only be proposed by Parliament, which means they actually require pretty much consensus across politics in order for a referendum to happen. That triple lock was made possible in 1983 by very particular domestic politics, widespread social conservatism, and religious institutional domination as it then existed in Ireland, as well as the way our Constitution works. But similarly, repeal in 2018 was also shaped by the distinctive politics and social conditions of Ireland that then pertained, including broad socio-legal changes like the Catholic Church's loss of institutional and political influence, very strange parliamentary arithmetic, which included a multi-party minority government, and previous experience of using a constitutional convention to lay the groundwork for major social constitutional change. In the previous case, it was marriage equality. That could be used to calm nervous politicians and give them a step-by-step route to change. So Ireland doesn't offer you a blueprint for change because there is no blueprint for change. But it does offer some important insights, and I want to finish with 3 of them. The first is that pro-choice activism can shape politics. A referendum could not have been possible without political will, and political will was built through decades of painstaking and highly sophisticated feminist activism and a critical period of intense activity after the death of Savita Halappanavar. Pro-choice activism educated politicians about the realities of abortion, including medication abortion. Pro-choice activists developed, endorsed, and worked within an incremental pathway towards reform that showed politicians how much popular support there actually was for change, and that the voices they heard the most were in fact the least numerous. People developed a range of levers, from international human rights institutions' condemnation to abortion storytelling and public art, to seek to get as many political actors as possible to the same destination, albeit by different routes. The development of pro-choice political will was a product of strategic sophistication, coalition building, and compromise. Secondly, Ireland tells us that there is power in law's futility. One of those compromises was the willingness, not natural to feminist activism, to continue to work with and within law, by exposing the fact that the Eighth Amendment did not stop abortions in Ireland or outside of it. For decades, politicians had turned a blind eye to foreign travel, but when they realised the scale and availability of self-managed abortion in Ireland, things changed. Thus, a dual effect was produced. The futility of keeping the Eighth was made clear, and the political urge to assert law's power through a new law that, among other things, would try to compel people back to formal medicalised settings was not unproblematically engaged. Finally, just as we see here in the United States, Ireland tells us that law is not enough. The Eighth Amendment didn't stop abortion. The 34th Amendment didn't start it. Law is just law. It's just part of the picture. For almost 50 years, pregnant people in this country had a constitutional right to access abortion, and millions could not. Now, none of you have a federal constitutional right to access abortion, but yet abortion is more available in some parts of the country than it was before. While the Irish experience thus offers insights, it gives us few concrete answers. Those answers lie instead in the particular legal, political, social, and professional dynamics at play at every level at which decisions that impact on reproductive justice, including access to dignified, high-quality abortion care, are being made. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiona, and thank you for keeping exactly to time. Ruby?
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ruby Lai. I'm a sociologist from Hong Kong. So I'm very happy to be here to share with you my study about abortion in China. Since 2012, I have been studying abortion in China. So I visited clinics and also hospital in China. I talked to women who have had abortions and also medical professionals who delivered abortion. So there are many observations that I'm happy to share with you. But for today's presentations, I would like to share with you the changes of abortion policies in contemporary China. So it's actually a very huge topic, and so I divided it into 3 phases. I will talk about the demographic crisis happening in China and how it would impact abortion policies and also reproductive experience of individuals in China. So, some background about abortion in China first. It is very different from what is happening in US and also in Ireland, I would say. So abortion was legalized in China in the early 1950s, and it was available on request. Okay, so in general, abortion is safe and forcible and widely accessible across different levels of medical facilities. So despite these leniencies, sex-selective abortion is strictly prohibited in China. So as you can see from the PowerPoint, those photos that I took during my fieldwork, so these are actually the advertisement of private hospital that's selling abortion services in China. So these advertisements were publicly displayed in subway stations or as freely distributed flyers or magazines that you can get from shopping center. So that was so everyday abortion was in China when I was doing my fieldwork. So this is the numbers of abortion. The annual number of abortion in China is relatively high compared to other countries. So in recent years, the number stayed at 9 million, which account for around 10% of the 73 million abortions taking place worldwide each year. But abortion in China is much more sophisticated than this number can summarize. So abortion in China is a common practice used by individuals and family to achieve the desirable number of children. It is a birth control measure subsumed under the family planning policy of the state, which is part of the modernization project, and it is instrumental, pragmatic, and flexible in terms of regulations and service provision. And it is always located within the negotiation between the state, the family, and individuals' reproductive agency. So I would kind of illustrate this dynamic relationship later. So in the first phase, which includes the feudal period and the Republican era, which is like many, many years ago, so it witnessed the transitions of control over abortions from the family to the state. So in feudal China, there was no traditions of prohibiting abortion by law in China based on moral or medical grounds. So abortion was considered a family matter that stayed inside the kin. So it was prohibited by law for the first time during the late Qing reform and further restricted by the Republican government in an attempt to modernize and strengthen China in the 1920s. So the change of abortion laws in this era was primarily triggered by foreign imperialism and was under heavy influence from the West. So it signified the departure from the Confucian tradition and non-interventionist approach to abortion to the Western legal tradition and conceptions of human life, which marked the beginning of biopolitical governance in China. So the second phase begins from the establishment of the People's Republic of China, which is a socialist China in 1949. So when discussing abortion in China, it's important to understand that these regulations were not explicitly written into law, so except the ban on sex-selective abortion. So abortion regulations are largely subsumed under the family planning policy, which varies across different provinces. So these approach create flexibility for the central government and also the local government to adjust the measure according to the socio-economic and political circumstances. So between the 1950s to 60s, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, realized the strategic importance of family planning to their modernization project, and therefore they start to launch the family planning campaigns to restrain birth. So since the one-child policy was implemented in 1979, abortion became an indispensable birth control measure to remedy the so-called unplanned birth. So during the period of forceful enforcement, so mandatory abortion was practices which undermined the family interests and also undermined individuals, especially women's health and rights. So apart from formulating their own way of controlling fertility, the CCP also integrated foreign practices into its biopolitical governance, so such as the importations of mifepristone in the early 1980s. So in this era, we see the formations of the biopolitical governance in the PRC. So the establishment of a multi-level bureaucratic structure enabled the state power to penetrate into individuals' reproduction. So besides, there was also the creation of a socialist abortion ethics that placed practical, collective, and state interests over the Confucian moralistic understanding and the Western religious discourse about abortion. So we will see how this apparatus transformed it in the next phase. So the first phase began in the 1990s and lasted until the recent decades. So the heavy-handed one-child policy created a lot of backlash internally and externally. So the CCP re-strategized and reformed the family planning program. On the one hand, the CCP started to promote internationalizations and the standards of quality care by adhering to the global trend of fostering reproductive health care through increasing international collaborations and improving the provisions of reproductive health care within the country. But on the other hand, the CCP strategically regulate abortion by banning sex-selective abortion to correct the skewed sex ratio as a result of the one-child policies. So more importantly, with the deepening of the impact of the market reform that started in 1970s, 1980s around, so the state forced the creation of a self-enterprising reproductive subject by imposing the dominant child-rearing standard of excellent birth and excellent rearing on married couple, and at the same time problematize abortion among young and unmarried through public health discourses to police unmarried people's reproductive behaviors. So behind all these governing at a distance strategies, abortion still serves as an indispensable birth control measure and an option made available for individuals to achieve their reproductive aspiration in line with the state eugenic rationale. So after visiting the past, the next question would be, what would be the future of abortion? So since the 2000s, China is facing an expanding aging population and also the steep decline in fertility. So we can see the narrowing gap. So this is a very alarming decline in fertility, and also the narrowing gap between the annual number of births and abortions in recent years. So in response to these disturbing trends, the CCP enforced the three-child policy in 2021, but unfortunately the effectiveness of these new measures is way below expectation. So scholars and families have been worrying for the potential restriction on abortions given the urge for the state to increase fertility. So we do witness some new development in recent years. For example, the state began to target at unmarried population, aiming at reducing the number of abortions for non-medical purposes and intervening in abortions among unmarried women. In some provinces, local governments have complicated the access to abortion by introducing gestational limits and administrative requirements for individuals to obtain abortion. So besides, as reported by the state media, the state may tighten the regulations on medical facilities, especially for those who are delivering abortion services, which may potentially undermine the access to the service. And lastly, in recent years, there has been a slow but notable emergence of anti-abortion discourses within the country. And you can see these abortion discourses disseminated on the media and also the internet, such as public health discourses that emphasize the harmful effect of abortion, and also the revival of Confucian and religious discourses that condemn the killing of life, and which is reinforced by the gender ideologies that essentialize female sexual conduct and reproductive vitality. So to conclude, in China, it's very different. So it is that abortion is a birth control measure and forced it on the ground of the state population agenda rather than individuals' reproductive rights. To understand abortion in China, we have to understand the relationship between individuals, the family, and also the state. Although the state monopolized the power over reproductions, but individuals still actively acquired reproductive autonomy through different types of strategies and through constant negotiation. So by looking at the history of contemporary history of abortion in China, we can also see considerable foreign influence. China has been learning from the West, not only by adopting and appropriating reproductive technologies and healthcare standards, but also learning the strategies and cost of restricting abortion. So that's why I think that the CCP is very cautious when it comes to restricting access to abortion, even they're facing such alarming demographic crisis. So under such skillfully crafted biopolitical governance, Reproductive agency is actualized by individuals, familial and relational strategy instead of collective advocacy and confrontational politics in China. And this model will probably continue in the near future. So this is the end of my presentation. And if you wanted to know more about abortion in China, there are many books, and this is one of the new one, which is happened to be written by me. So sorry for stealing the panel. So thank you very much.
So again, thank you for packing so much into the time allotted. Thanks very much, Ruby, and I'm sure a lot of people will be looking for the book. Donald, can we turn it over to you?
Thank you very much. Interesting talks that have preceded me. So let's begin with my perspective. Witnessing the horrors of the Second Global War, World War II, in the 20th century, key American leaders in business, philanthropic foundations, and academia concluded that future wars could be prevented by population control. This neo-Malthusian worldview took deep root in America and global elites. The obsession with global and national population control as a panacea for addressing the problems of the world cannot be overemphasized. Population control manifests itself in policy initiatives internationally and domestically, as well as funding efforts to develop better, more effective contraceptive measures. This belief in the necessity of population control led to the establishment of family planning programs and centers in Asia, Western Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. The development of domestic and internationally supported family planning occurred in 3 stages. In the first stage, philanthropists, military leaders, and wealthy industrialists, as well as scientific experts, joined together to undertake one of the most massive efforts at social engineering seen in history, the control of global population growth. Giving voice to this charge of reducing the rate of population growth, John D. Rockefeller III organized the Population Council in 1952. The first draft of the charter spoke for the need to control overpopulation and for creating conditions in which, quote, parents who are above average in intelligence and quality of personality, unquote, produce, quote, larger than average families, unquote. Others joining the cause were Planned Parenthood of America, the Population Crisis Committee funded by Hugh Moore, the founder of Dixie Cup. He and others, Moore and others in the International Planned Parenthood, were critical in organizing the first international conference of voluntary sterilization in 1964. The Ford Foundation poured millions of dollars into population control programs, and in the early 1960s, the United Nations, at the prompting of American and world leaders, got involved in the worldwide effort to reduce population growth. In the second stage of family planning occurred in the Johnson administration, as the Johnson administration moved into federally supported domestic family planning in a big way. The federal government's involvement in domestic and international family planning in this period drew bipartisan support in Congress. In 1965 alone, 8 family planning bills were introduced in Congress. The Office of Economic Opportunity under the Johnson administration launched 45 family planning projects located in public housing projects, churches, community centers. Under Richard Nixon's administration, these programs were enlarged through the Family Planning Services and Population Research Act in 1970. The United States extended its international efforts at family planning. For example, the United States Agency for International Development launched family planning projects on a global basis. Head of this agency, Reimer Havehold, a population control fanatic, had his business cards printed on condoms. The third, I thought that might get a larger chuckle, but just like teaching at ASU, gang. So anyway, when Pope John VI issued Humanae Vitae in the summer of 1967, the Catholic Church reiterated its historic opposition to artificial contraception and abortion while affirming its traditional teachings on the sanctity of life. Although the Catholic Church's opposition to abortion was long-standing, many public officials and general American public did not fully understand the issue or the social ramifications of liberalizing abortion laws that began on the state level before the Roe decision. An amusing example of this confusion on the abortion issue is found in Nelson Rockefeller, governor of New York. In the late 60s, when Governor Rockefeller grappled with the moral complexity of the abortion question, he came across a quote in an op-ed of Thomas Aquinas. He immediately sent instructions to his aides to arrange a meeting with this Thomas Aquinas guy. Until 1970 or so, population control remained a bipartisan issue. This began to change with the abortion issue and the rise of what became known as social conservatism within the Republican Party. The shift within the Republican Party became apparent in 1973 when Richard Nixon rejected the findings of his National Commission on Population Growth and America's Future, chaired by John D. Rockefeller III. The commission recommended making abortion on request, as it was phrased, and restricting immigration. This commission's report observed that, quote, "We are impressed that induced abortion has a good demographic effect when legalized," unquote. Rockefeller saw Nixon's rejection of this report as playing a political calculus to win conservative Catholic voters. But moreover, he felt that an intransigent and unenlightened American public was a major obstacle to advancing liberalized abortion. And through a carefully calculated strategy, Rockefeller, the Population Council, and Rockefeller-associated foundations decided to undertake a campaign to advance liberalization of American social mores. Liberal social mores, he believed, would create a better climate for legalized abortion. He extended his financial support to National Abortion Rights Action League, Planned Parenthood, ACLU's Reproduction Freedom Project, the Center for Constitutional Rights, Alan Guttmacher Institute, Zero Population Growth, and Catholics for Choice. Rockefeller, at the same time, increased funding for organizations promoting sex education, such as Dr. Mary Calderon's Sex Information and Educational Council, and he also funded a special project from Calderon's organization in New York to make students aware of their sexual identities and to overcoming guilt feelings about self-exploration, masturbation, or the exploration of genitals of other children. He provided major funding for the New York public television documentary, Who Are We?, a pro-gay documentary, the first made in the United States. At the same time, Rockefeller and his staff held meetings with major magazine editors, journalists, and television producers to promote liberal sexual values. Why was this fight over legalized abortion so intense in the United States? And I think that needs further exploration, especially when other Western European countries, as well as China, have more restrictive abortion laws than does the United States. One explanation, at least for Western Europe, might rest in the importance of the dignity of the individual, conscience, and human rights that appeared in the post-Second World War Europe. While European countries enacted restrictive abortion law, debate over family planning erupted in full blast within the United States, within the United Nations, beginning with the United Nations World Population Conference in Bucharest in 1974. Debate over family planning, abortion, population control intensified in subsequent UN conferences. The United States and the United Nations involvement in programs, especially population control programs, especially the implementation of these programs in India and Southeast Asia, are fully explored in Matthew Conley's The Fatal Misconception, The Struggle to Control World Population. And by the way, Matthew Conley, a Columbia professor, is pro-abortion. On the international policy front, an alliance developed with the Catholic Church, representatives of Muslim countries, and at times with feminists critical of human rights abuses. At this point in our scholarship, we have detailed, in fact, a cottage industry of the history and politics of abortion in America. Scholarship on the legal technicalities of abortion fill volumes. Needed, in my view, is for scholars to explore the larger philosophical, polity, cultural, and psychological context of the abortion debate. Are we confronted with what philosopher Alistair McIntyre calls incommensurable values, a clash of worldviews that cannot be reconciled? The ferocity of the abortion debate might be set within a complex phenomena that cannot be attributed to any single social, economic, or cultural cause, but it might be set within a context of a cultural context of hyper-individualism, urbanization, or classical liberalism. The psychological tenacity of those holding strong passions and beliefs on abortion are just beginning to be explored by social psychologists. Within a political context, passion restrains discussion, a free exchange of ideas, and often precludes compromise if it's to be reached. We look forward in this panel and the conference for free expression and exchange of ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you again. All the panelists have been perfect in terms of timekeeping.
Oh, thank you.
I want to ask a question to each of the panelists. We already have a number of questions, and I would encourage anybody in the live audience or online to add their questions through Slido, and we will get to them. But I just want to follow up, and some of it picks up on what has been asked through Slido in terms of Latin America. So Fiona, I want to turn to you. Many of the 3 lessons you gave us from the Irish experience actually resonate quite a lot with some of what happened in Argentina, for example. The idea that pro-choice activism can change politics, that constructive activism is not some technical guidance operation just with international foreign committees, but it actually is deeply engaged in political change. And also the power of the law's futility, the years and years in Argentina where feminists documented failures in individual cases to get access to abortion when they were entitled to do so under exceptions to criminalization. And then, of course, that the law is not enough. But one of the things that I really wanted to point to was in Argentina, the effort at social decriminalization. For years and years before the legal change in 2020 was incredibly important, and we are seeing now that it is important in the effectiveness of implementation of the new legal regime in Argentina. The second thing I wanted to ask you about is that there was a framing in not just Argentina, but across the Green Wave of draconian abortion restrictions as a manifestation of structural violence, analogous to femicides, other kind of violence in these very patriarchal and violent societies, violence, environmental violence, violence of the workplace, economic violence, and I'm wondering if that played a role in Ireland as well.
Thank you. Let me, address your first point first. I mean, I think social decriminalization, by which I think perhaps you mean not reporting, not enforcing, depenalization, but also maybe higher levels of social acceptance. Yeah, destigmatization. Yeah, that was critical in Ireland, but came quite late in the day. I mean, one of the things, and it's hard to kind of articulate what a constitutional ban on abortion produces in terms of social, I don't know what the right word is, consciousness, maybe, you know, where people actually don't really even know what abortion is, to be honest. You know, apart from in theory, you know, I remember people telling politicians about medication abortion, and I mean, people my age, in their 40s, did not know it existed, including people who worked in like the Department of Health. So destigmatization, storytelling, public art interventions, education, accurate information is absolutely critical to groundwork, but as you say, also then to making things work, making things tick along. And one of the significant barriers that are currently being experienced in terms of effective provision of abortion care in Ireland is that strictly abortion remains a crime. So that medical institutions and professionals are extremely wary of going anywhere near the boundaries of legality. So that 12 weeks actually works like 10 weeks. A risk of serious injury to health actually works like a serious risk of harm to health, so that the social meaning is higher, and the professional meaning threshold is higher. And I think that is perhaps partly a product of both continued formal criminalization and incomplete social decriminalization, particularly in professional contexts. The point about understanding draconian restrictions as part of broader kind of violences or institutional challenges, as you can imagine, has resonance in Ireland. Those of you who are familiar with Ireland's politics and contemporary history will know that it is, the Irish state is built and has developed within extremely problematic and not yet entirely recognized and reconciled structures of gendered violence, particularly around sexuality and reproduction. It's not unusual in post-colonial states. We're a very young country. People kind of forget, not even 100 years since our first free constitution in 1937, only just over 100 years since we got effective home rule in 1922 as a partitioned country. So that is kind of normal, I think, maybe in that context, but certainly something that resonates in its different ways in different jurisdictions. And I thought of it a lot last night as people were understanding and articulating politics around abortion in this jurisdiction as being really about a lot more than abortion, about structures of endemic and unresolved deep structural inequalities.
Thanks. So I'm going to turn to Ruby and combine my own questions with a question that has come in on Slido. And there are a couple things you quickly quickly mentioned, but didn't have a chance to go into in depth. And one of them is the panels at ICPD and Beijing and the international human rights movement and growth of that discourse. And what the reaction was in China and how that influenced developments thereafter. And a question from Slido is, what is the relationship between the undervaluation of girls and the use of echography and abortion, or what they say is femicide? You did mention the ban on sex-selective abortions, but I wonder if you could do that. And also I have given the situation we're in the United States now, you also mentioned that gestational limits vary across provinces. And I'm wondering if people travel from province to province to get abortions in China.
Okay, so the first question, so I think that this is related to the third phase, right? So like particularly in the 90s, after the Beijing conference in Beijing, I think there was many changes. And one of the changes is that some international NGO, they opened their branches in China, and that kind of reproductive healthcare and rights, and also the healthcare standard or the services that China open up for these opportunities. And so one of the clinics that I'm working with actually is entered China later. So that's it's very important because China did incorporate the global trend of reproductive health, and it becomes not just national but also many locals and grassroots initiative. And so a few years ago, I visited China, and there's a very nice conference that gathered different, we consider activists, but then organizers from different groups, some working on young people and some working on LGBT communities. They are also promoting reproductive health in China. So I think the impact lasts for a very long time, since the 90s. And so the second question is for sex-selective abortion, right? So it's actually the one-child policies, one of the consequences of the one-child policies. As you can see, there's many research already documented the impact and the consequence of it, the skewed sex ratio. And so the Chinese government began to banned selective abortions around 2000. And so yet we can see that now, like in recent years, that there are improvements in the sex ratio in China. So I guess I would see that's one progressive things that happen in China, I would say. And so the third question is that the provincial gestational differences. So as I said, this is not abortion regulations is not written as law as in the state or in Ireland or in other countries. So this is actually the local government, the provincial government can set the measures. And so it kind of allows flexibilities for the local governments too, because they can propose some new regulations, and then people may voice out the ideas and feedbacks about that new regulations, whether it's acceptable or not. Actually, it's quite still very accessible. I mean, abortion in China. So it's you don't need to travel to other provinces to get abortion. So you just go to a hospital to get abortion. And so I remembered one of my informants when I told her that in some places you cannot get abortion. And she was so shocked. And she said that it's good that I'm born in China, so I can access it freely. So it actually illustrated the complications, because I believe that the access to abortion doesn't mean the realizations of reproductive justice. Yes, it's very accessible in China, abortion, but then still the options for women are still constrained under existing regime. I mean, the biopolitical governance under China. So that's...
May I add just one brief comment, somewhat off topic but related to China. We are on the verge of a technological revolution, and that has to do with the gain of function research. I've been in long conversations with people on the cutting edge of this, and as you know, China pioneered in this with a lot of global blowback. But that is going to change the nature of, we're on the verge of genetic engineering. So that's going to change the whole nature of what we're talking about with reproductive rights, as well as abortion for gender selective sex abortions. Anyway, just something to point out to everybody to keep, so we don't get too bogged down in history and contemporary controversy.
So I think during the day, assisted reproductive technologies and assisted gestative technologies will be discussed at more length. Donald, I wanted to actually underscore something that you said by giving an example and then push back a little bit as well. So I lived in Peru for 5 years when the USAID was underwriting a family planning program that ended up sterilizing involuntarily approximately 272,000 women, overwhelmingly indigenous women, following much of the same kinds of fragmentation in the country, racism and colonialism that is on display now in what is going on in Peru. And certainly all of us, I think, whatever our perspectives are committed to the idea of reproductive justice of women and other gestating persons deciding if, when, and how they want to have children and having the necessary supports and conditions to raise them. Thanks. But in that case in Peru, what happened was after the scandal came to light, and we did bring a case to the Inter-American Commission, the next government that came into power, the Minister of Health, and it had international repercussions, the next government that came into power was really very right-wing, to the right of Opus Dei, extremely Catholic, limited access to contraception dramatically. And that resulted in the Tiahrt Amendment, as you know, which prohibits U.S. family planning money to go to countries where sterilization is used. And what I was going to push back on is that it seems like it's a little bit of a one-sided story. There is absolutely no question that the U.S. government has been involved in family planning escapades that have not respected the rights of women in other countries, and that there very well may have been eugenic drivers of those policies. But it is equally true that the United States, for example, in the global gag rule and in a whole bevy of other policies, goes back and forth. There are multiple different forces at work. And I think some of what you are pointing out is the sort of abuse of our power in the global political economy and different kinds of structural dependencies. Because whether there's misuse of family planning programs or whether there's restriction on abortion, the poorest and most marginalized people are the ones who tend to suffer. So I was wondering if you had any kind of reaction to that it's not just on one side, it's on both sides.
Yeah, I think the United States government has been a major driver in this. In some of the programs in forced sterilization, but so is the United Nations. Under Indira Gandhi, millions of village women were forced sterilization. They used troops to surround villages and sterilization for men and women. But there was a blowback, and it came primarily from feminists, but we still have today family planning programs in villages in Southeast Asia and other places in which there are food inducement programs with to have volunteer village women who are given reproductive contraception without the kind of medical infrastructure necessary in these villages to prevent them from having the ill consequences of these programs. So I think that the feminist movement within the United Nations, as well as combined efforts of other groups, have been instrumental in calling out these abuses. But there are abuses within the system, and they shouldn't just be attributed to the United States, but a kind of a partnership of countries in the United Nations itself.
May I add just one thing? I think a broader point that this conversation also raises is actually around policy formation and processes of policy formation, and how, for whom are things like international aid policy or technical assistance, for whom are they actually being developed? In other words, who is it that we think is going to be helped? And very often with financially powerful states, and I don't come from one, Ireland, but I live in one, the UK, the focus of the policy formation is not actually the people who will experience the policy in real life. It's the state, of course, that's giving the money. So there is, a question about who is within the policy formation process, what kind of evidence is used, what is valued within those processes, and not just because we're in the Radcliffe, also like what would be added if arts and humanities and other perspectives were brought to actually trying to understand problems and think about policy interventions that might be valuable, rather than hard, money fixes developed in a technocratic way, which is what I think you often see with interventions of this kind.
So I'm going to turn to the audience questions now, and this is probably mostly for you, Fiona. It's about the loss of credibility of the Catholic hierarchy caused by the abuse crisis, or just in general. I can say that in Latin America, the lessening of the Catholic Church's grip has played a significant role in facilitating activism. I think that at the same time, evangelical activism has increased in Latin America, but we'd love to hear about what happened in Ireland.
We don't have enough time to hear about all the many things that happened in Ireland, but of course, revelations of endemic abuse, physical, emotional, and sexual, and perhaps more consequently, failures of accountability within the institutional church and within the state, I think were critical to the marginalization of the institutional Catholic Church as a critical political actor within Ireland. But I think it's just important to also say this is in some ways also part of kind of democratic maturation. When Ireland became independent, most of our welfare, schools, hospitals, poor houses, whatever you want to call them, all institutions were actually provided by the Catholic Church, and with the state supplementing or just relying on those. So there's kind of a long history of state failure to be the actor in the provision of, the core fabric of statehood, let's say, which is what enables this kind of influence. So while there is no longer significant political and social influence in an institutional way on the part of the church, a lot of our critical infrastructure, I will call it, including hospitals and schools, are still under the management of the Catholic Church. So there is, further work to be done in terms of effective division of state and church relations in order to, enable religious institutions' influence to be important, valued, and protected for persons for whom it is relevant, but to force the state to be the accountable and primary actor in the provision of social goods, which within our constitutional and political framework is what it's for.
So there are actually lots of questions on Ireland, but I'm going to try to spread it around. So this is a question to you, Donald. Did the Population Council Rockefeller Foundation try to spread their policy views to Western Europe? And if so, what were the specific drivers of resistance?
Yes, they had, and this is a complex question in some ways. The Population Council under Rockefeller, Ford, and other groups decided to stay away from domestic U.S. policy, and so they targeted international family planning efforts. And they did that and so they were in contact with European leaders as well in order to institute family planning. Initially, they looked at a major target were in the beginning of their programs were in Asia, particularly Japan, where they set up family planning clinics, and I think they were quite successful. Japan now has a demographic crisis, not because of John D. Rockefeller and population control, but for other reasons, but also had to do with urbanization and so forth. So why don't I end it there? Otherwise, we'll have too long answers, and I think we're beginning to get those, and I could give longer ones, but anyway.
Okay, great.
I can rival anyone on those. Any
this-
professor, challenge.
This is for Ruby. What is the role of feminist activism organizations in discussions of abortion access as discourses shift to moralizing claims against abortion?
Well, that's a difficult question. So when it comes to abortion access in China, I can't say that it's a struggle for the access because this is actually part of the family planning policy. So like for many, like the women I talk to, they don't really consider it as a right, like women's right, except for one that studied feminism. So for so long, like for decades, Chinese people don't, like women themselves don't see that as actually a right. And also for the frontline organizations or organizers or even the providers of abortion services, they don't really use that, like put forward the kind of reproductive right or right-based discourses when they are delivering actual reproductive health care to women. So, so as I said, because of the demographic crisis that China is facing right now, so feminists begin to worry about the potential future, whether this restriction on the access of abortion. And given the political environment in China, it's quite difficult for collective and organized confrontational politics to happen. And yeah, and but I think that many of these organizations and organizers, they will still do what they are doing all the time and focus on the provisions of reproductive care and women's health. So many of them will focus on that. But I do think that for some feminists who are like more vocal, may not necessarily living in China right now, so they may force out when the access is really going to be limited.
Yeah, out of wedlock, we don't have good figures on out of wedlock, what used to be called out of wedlock births in China. We do have good figures in Hong Kong, however. And out of wedlock births are very low in Hong Kong University. Hong Kong, I taught at Hong Kong, so I taught at Hong Kong, HKU. But we have very low out of birth figures in Hong Kong, which is interesting because it's highly urbanized, but has to do a lot with kind of social mores there and family values. But also that I think reduces the number of abortions too that might occur without a wedlock pregnancy. So any discussion of China, Hong Kong, which is part of China now, needs to be framed within that context.
So, sorry, can I just get to a few more of the
Sure.
questions? So, Ruby, one follow-up, which I'm also interested in, is how does the Chinese government determine if an abortion was sex-selective? Does that violate medical confidentiality? Does that?
So they have a very detailed law So they have a very detailed law to differentiate whether that is sex-selective abortion. And so I'm not specialized in law, but then that's law, I think if I remember correctly, it's like is in 2003. Okay, so and then it's kept revising and it's still effective right now. And then there's also some campaigns that's called to the too ill or too illegitimate. So it's actually about banning sex-selective abortion and the way to know the sex of the baby. So, but then there is law there and there's regulations there, but then people will also use their own way to achieve what they want. And as I said, like people will use individuals and familial strategy to achieve their desirable reproductive outcome. And so some of the, even there's like, for example, there's one-child policies and one-child quotas, and people will still like wealthy people then pay for the social maintenance fee in order to have more babies, and which is actually a stratified reproduction, an example of stratified reproduction. And yes, I kind of like went away from the question, but so that's law there, and very detailed, and I can't give the law that to you right now, but yeah, so yeah, it's, yeah, you can check that. Yeah.
So a number of these questions go to how do views on abortion interact with miscarriage or different health and mental, physical, and health exceptions or non-viable fetuses. And which also picks up on this question of how do you really know that it's sex-selective versus another abortion? And I think really the truth is that regimes that are based on exceptions don't really work, right? We know in this country since Dobbs, women prefer to travel across state lines than wait and see if their health condition is going to be serious enough to trigger an exception that doctors are willing to do. As Fiona said, there's a cushion between if it's up to 12 weeks, doctors won't want to touch it if it's more than 10 weeks. So I think that's in practice what happens with the effective enjoyment of these rights. I think we have time for one last question and really very, very brief remarks, and it's a big one.
40 minutes, 40 seconds, okay.
It's how can we promote access to abortion care and reproductive justice while also warning against the harmful societal repercussions of, limiting certain populations?
I mean, I don't know the answer, but I would suggest that it must at least in part lie with normalizing conversations about abortion, as well as reproduction, pregnancy loss, contraception, sexual consent, enjoyment, emancipation, desire, happiness, fulfillment in all of our lives, and see it all as one conversation.
And I echo with you, and I think that open discussions and sharings is very important, especially in the context of China. And so although there's quite restrictive environment, but then women still share their stories of abortion online, even though they may be censored like suddenly and disappeared right away, but then people still talk about their experience. So I think that's very important, and that's maybe the first step of collective action, maybe. Yeah.
I'll get back to you later this afternoon after we hear from the other panels.
Okay, great. Well, I want to thank all our panelists, and I think that among many other insights, we've seen that, it's not really appropriate to do some kind of stylized comparison of abortion laws just in the abstract, but we really need to understand how they work in practice, and that's always a factor of socio-historical and political forces that inform the use of law. Thanks very much, and I'll turn it over to Jane Kamensky.
Thank you all so much. If a goal of the conference is for everybody to learn something new, it seems impossible not to have done so with these three excellent speakers and our moderator who brought her Latin American experience to the fore, so we covered a lot of the globe. We have a break now until precisely 11 o'clock Eastern, when our Zoomies and our roomies can collectively rejoin us for a panel on race and class. I'll see you in 15 minutes.